Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you are well. So in this video we'll talk about context API. So what is context API, what does it do, and how to use it, and most importantly what problem does it solve. So if you are someone who has probably heard about context API but you don't really know what it is and how to use it, so I hope that by the end of this video you'll be getting a good idea about that. So now let's begin. So in order to explain what is context API, before that I want to talk about why do we need to use context API and what's the problem does it solve. Okay, so let's talk about prop drilling. So in React there is something called prop drilling. So suppose in a React application you have a parent component and you have a child component. Now so you want to pass data from parent to child. Now how do you do that? The answer is using props. So you have to use props to pass data from parent to child. But this is fine, but the problem is when you have deeply nested component. That means, let's look at this example. So we have a app.js and inside that we are rendering component A, and inside that we are rendering component B, and inside that we are rendering component C. So here we have some data in the app.js, we have an object. Now we want to pass that data to the component C. Now how do we do that? So you cannot directly pass data from app to C, because this app component C, it is not being directly rendered in the app.js. Instead, you have to pass the data from app component to component C through every component. That means you have to first pass the data from app to component A, then component A to component B, and then you have to pass the data from component B to component C. And this is called as prop drilling. And well, using prop drilling, you can pass the data, that is fine, but you can see that component A and component B has nothing to do with this data. They don't need it, but just because we have to pass the data to component C, that is the reason we have to pass the data through component A and component B, and that is becomes a problem. And now to solve this problem we can use context API. So using context API, what we can do is that we can directly pass the data from the app.js to component C. We do not need to pass the data through the component A and component B. We can directly pass the data from component A to component C. So that is what the benefit of context API. So you can directly pass data between any components. It doesn't matter how much deeply nested they are. So that was about the introduction about how to what is the context API and what problem does it solve. Now let's go back to VS Code and let's see how we can use it. Alright, so now I am back in my VS Code. So now so basically here before start we have some boilerplate code that I have written. So I'll quickly explain to you what does this code do. So basically we have created three components. We have created a folder called components, and inside that we have created three component A, B and C. So and inside component A we are rendering component B, and inside component B we are rendering component C. And yeah, and then we have the component C, and basically the component A is being rendered in the app.js component, and then it is seeing in the screen. If you look at this diagram, so exactly the same thing we have done here. So app A, inside that component A, component B and component C are rendering. Okay, so here the thing is, so suppose inside the app.js we have some data. Okay, suppose we have some count. Okay, now we want to pass this data from app component to component C. So now I will show you how you can pass it using context API. Okay, so in order to use context API, first what we have to do is that we have to create a context. So basically I will create a file name as user context, but you can give it any name you want. I will give it a name as user context. Now inside that I will create a component, and here you have to create the context. Okay, so I will give the context as let me do one thing, let me remove that let me rename it to count context, since we will be passing the count. Okay, count context. Now what we have to do is that we have to create a context. So actually React provides us a function called create context, so we'll be using that. So I've imported the create context, and now I'll create a context here. Okay, so I have created this count context, and let me actually make it as provider. Okay, let me rename it as provider. Now what this will do is that it will provide the it will create a provider for that this context. Okay, so I'll create okay, basically let me create a count context dot provider, and this function, this will actually take the children prop and will render the children here. Okay, so basically what we have done is that, you know, we have basically we have created the count context and we have created a provider for this context. Okay, so now what we have to do is that we have to use this provider to wrap our component. Okay, so we will go to the main.jsx file, and here we have to import that thing. So we have to import this count context provider, and wrap our entire component, entire application with that. Okay, so we have done that. And now what we can do is that, so first thing, so I just to revise, so first you have to create a context, and after that you have to create a provider for that context. So we have done that, and now we have to wrap that provider, I mean wrap our entire application with that provider. So that is also done. Now we can pass, so actually this provider, it takes a parameter called value, and inside that we can pass whatever value we want to share with other components. Okay, so what I will do is that I will, whatever this data, I will put it here. So, and we have to import the useState hook also. So imported that. Now we want to pass this count as a value here. Okay, so let me pass that. Okay, so here we have passed that value. Now we want to share that value. Okay, so now I want the value to be like I want to count context to be passed here. Okay, so I can just, so I want to use it in the component C. So now I can just directly import it here, and I have to use a hook called use context. So I've imported that, and I have to also import that what was that name? If we see here, this thing count context, we have to import that here. So actually I just found out that here we have to import it, I mean the export it. If you don't export it, then we won't be able to import it in other components. So now we can import it. So use count context. Okay, so that is imported now. Now we will consume this context using the use context hook. So we can pass this context here, count context. Now whatever value that we had passed, we can just extract that from here. So you can pass it like that. Okay, so basically so you can see, if you see in this context, count context, so we have passed this count. So the same thing we can do here. We can just extract that same variable from here. Now now we should be able to like use it. If we pass it count, now if we save it and if we refresh the screen, okay, there is some error. What it is saying, count is not defined. Okay, so count we have done, set count, and we have done that here. Now let's check in the component C. Okay, we have to make it count. Sorry, I have give it a name. Okay, yeah, now the count is fine. So you can see now the count is visible here. Okay, so that is how you can basically share data across different components directly. Okay, so first of all, what you have to do is that you have to create a context. Once that context is created, then you have to create a provider for that context. Now we have done that, and now you have to wrap our entire component, entire application with that provider. So if you see in the main.jsx file, we have wrapped that, and after that you can import that context in any component. So we have imported that, and we have consumed that using use context hook, and now you can use this value. Okay, so that is how you can use context API to share data. So I'll just give you another example. So I want to use it in the app.js also. So what I will do is that, and here the important thing is that, suppose component A, the app component is also showing that data, and the component C also showing that data. Now if we update the component C value, then the same value will be updated across entire application. So I'll just give you a demo for that. So let me import that count context and also import the use context hook here. and now I will print the value here, count. Okay, if we refresh the screen, so you can see it is showing the value here. Now what I will do is that, let me do one thing. So yeah, so now you are only passing the value. Now we will also pass the value to update, like this set count will pass that here, set count. Okay, now you can see inside the component C we will use that set count, and now we will just simply create a button here. When that button is clicked, we will increase that count. Okay, if we refresh this page, okay, that's fine. Now you can see when we click on this button, you can see, so we are actually clicking this button from component C, but it is also reflecting the change in the component, app component as well. So that is because the value is coming from the context, and when we are updating the value from the context, then that context value, in the entire application, the updated value will be published. So that is the reason this context API can be very useful. So you can see, like here, when this button is clicked, it is calling the set count, and that set count is actually getting from the context. So if you see in the context, so it actually globally updates that value, and same the updated value will be passed in the app.js as well. So you can see in the app.js also we are, so basically when you are clicking on the count, so it is increasing the count in the app.js as well. So this is how you can use context API, and you can use it to share data across any component. Directly you can share data across any component in a React application. So that was a simple example of how you can use context API in React to share data directly across any components. So I hope this video was useful to you, and you have gotten good idea about how you can use context API. If you still have any questions or doubt, then you can put them in the comment below. And that's it from my end today. Thanks for watching.